The day I turned 20, my stepmother left a garbage bag outside my bedroom door. Not a gift bag, not a moving box, a black plastic trash bag, the kind you use for leaves. Everything I owned fit inside it with room to spare. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I had known since my father died 8 months earlier that the clock was running. I just hadn't expected the alarm to go off on my birthday. I dragged the bag down the stairs of the house I had lived in since I was 11, loaded it into the back of a car I could barely afford to insure, and drove away from the only home I had ever known. I was 20 years old. I had $312 in checking account, a collection of secondhand textbooks I had already sold back, and no idea what came next. My name is Nora Voss, and this is the story of a tugboat, a dead man's secret, and the most unexpected home I have ever found. I want to pause here before we go any further, because I know there are people watching this who are in exactly that kind of moment right now. The moment where the thing you were counting on just disappeared. Maybe it was a relationship. Maybe it was a job. Maybe someone you loved took something from you that you can never get back. If that's you, stay with me. This story is for you. Hit subscribe, because what comes next took me completely by surprise, and I think it might surprise you too. For the first 6 weeks after my stepmother threw me out, I lived in my car, a 2009 Civic with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked when it wanted to. I parked in different spots every night, rest stops, church parking lots, the far and a Cracker Barrel in Macon, Georgia that I will be forever grateful for. I had a routine. Gym membership for showers, library for Wi-Fi, dollar menu for dinner. I kept myself clean and functional because I had learned that the moment you stop looking like you belong somewhere, doors start closing faster than you can open them. I was looking for work, apply for anything. Warehouse shifts, call centers, administrative roles for which I was clearly overqualified by exactly 1 semester of dropped-out community college. Nothing was sticking. The problem with having no permanent address is that it follows you everywhere, invisible but heavy, like a stone in your pocket. My father had been a riverman. That's the only way I know how to say it. He worked on the Chattahoochee and then the Savannah River for most of his adult life. First as a deckhand, then as a pilot on a small commercial tug. He smelled like diesel and coffee and river water, and when he talked about the water, his whole face changed. He was a different person out there. Lighter. When he died of a heart attack at 54, I thought that world died with him. My stepmother sold everything, his truck, his gear, his small collection of navigational charts he kept rolled up in the hall closet. She moved fast, like she was afraid he might come back and reclaim it. I didn't fight her. I was grieving in 20, and I didn't know I was allowed to. I found a listing by accident, which I now believe is the only way you can find something that is truly meant for you. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the Forsyth County Public Library. I had been on the county government auction site for 3 hours, looking at the usual parade of seized vehicles and tax-defaulted properties, when I scrolled past something that stopped me cold. Decommissioned river tugboat, 58 feet, steel hull, vessel name, the Mira Jean, starting bid, $10, buyer responsible for towing and mooring fees, sold as is. No seaworthiness guarantee. Auction closes Friday. I stared at it for a long time. There was one photograph. It was taken from a dock, and it showed the tugboat sitting low in the water, her hull streaked with rust and river sediment, her wheelhouse windows dark. She looked tired. She looked like something that had been working very hard for a very long time and had finally been allowed to stop. The auction listing said she'd been in county impound for 2 years after her registered owner, a man named George Aldrich Fenn, died without next of kin and without a will. The county had been paying the mooring fees. They wanted her gone. I had $312. I had moored at 0 places in my life. I knew virtually nothing about tugboats beyond what my father had told me over dinners. I only half listened because I was 17 and thought I had better things to do. I have regretted that every single day since he died. I looked at that photograph for a long time. The name on the hull was still legible. Mira Jean. It had been painted carefully, in a script that looked personal, not stenciled, painted by hand. Someone had loved this boat. I put in a bid for $10. The confirmation email arrived at 6:14 on Friday morning. I was in the Cracker Barrel parking lot again, curled in the back seat with my jacket over my shoulders, and my phone buzzed, and I read it 3 times. Congratulations. You are the successful bidder on Lot 7741, B, vessel Mira Jean. Final bid, $10. Please contact the Wilkins County Harbor Master's office within 21 days to arrange transfer of registration and vacate mooring. I sat up and looked out the foggy window at the parking lot in the early morning dark and said out loud to nobody, "What did I just do?" Then I started the car and drove toward the river. The Wilkins County Marina was 40 miles south of where I had been parking, a small worker marina on the Altamaha River that smelled of brine and outboard fuel and something organic and alive underneath it all. A man named Dix Cawley ran the harbor master's office. He was 60-something, deeply tanned, with the kind of hands that suggested he had done real physical work every day of his life. When I told him I was there about the Mira Jean, he looked at me the way the county clerk looked at the sisters in the diner story, like he was trying to figure out if I was a problem or a solution. "You the one who bid $10? He said. "Yes, sir." "How old are you?" 20. He looked me over, not unkindly. "You know anything about boats?" My father was a river pilot. Worked tugs for 20 years. It was the first time I had said that out loud since the funeral, and it hurt in a way I hadn't expected. Dix was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come on, I'll walk you out." She was moored at the far end of the dock, past the pleasure crafts and the fishing rigs, in a slip that seemed slightly set apart, the way you put something in storage, in the back corner, out of the way. She was bigger than the photograph suggested. 58 feet of steel hull, dark with age and use. Her cabin rising up with the solid, no-nonsense geometry of a working vessel. The name on the bow was weathered, but still there. Mira Jean. I stepped onto the deck, and it moved under me. That first, primal shift of a floating surface. And something happened in my chest that I don't have an adequate word for. A recognition. Like something clicking into place. Dix watched from the dock. "She's watertight," he said. "I'll give her that. George kept her hull in good shape. It's everything else that's a mess." I walked the deck slowly. The wheelhouse door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Inside smelled of decades. Diesel, old upholstery, the ghost of pipe tobacco, the particular dampness of vessel that has been sitting still when it was built to move. The instruments were old but intact. The wheel was wooden, polished smooth by years of hands. The chart table held a laminated map of the Altamaha River system, its contour lines soft with age. And on the shelf above the chart table, held in place by 2 small brackets, was a framed photograph. A man in his 50s, maybe early 60s, stood at the wheel of the Mira Jean with both hands resting on it, and his face turned toward the camera with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. Behind him, through the wheelhouse windows, you could see river and sky and light. He looked like a man who had exactly what he needed. On the back of the frame, in black marker, George. Altamaha, 1998. George Aldrich Fenn. The man who had owned this boat. The man who had died without a will, without next of kin, without anyone to leave her to. I stood there for a long time, just looking at his face. What happened to him? I called out to Dix. He appeared in the wheelhouse doorway. Heart attack. Alone on the boat, as far as anyone can tell. Coast Guard found the Mira Jean drifting about 3 miles downriver. George was in the engine room. Dix paused. He died the way he lived, on the water. I thought about my father. Did he have family? Nobody came forward. We ran the notices for a year. Nothing. Dix looked at the photograph. He was a good man. Kept to himself mostly, but good. Helped everybody who asked. Never asked for anything back. He was quiet for a beat. I'm glad somebody bought her. I didn't want to see her scrapped. I looked around the wheelhouse, at the worn instruments, the careful hands-on maintenance, the photograph of a man who loved his vessel so much he spent his last moments in her engine room. I'll take good care of her, I said. And even though I had no idea how to do that, I meant it. Now, I want to stop here for a second because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, a 20-year-old woman with no money, no experience, and nowhere to live just bought a tugboat. That's either the bravest thing you've ever heard or the most reckless, depending on your personality. And honestly, you might be right either way. But here's the thing I've learned about desperation. It's not always a weakness. Sometimes it's the only thing that gets you through the door you were too sensible to walk through before. If you've ever done something that looked crazy from the outside, but felt absolutely right on the inside, drop a comment. I want to hear about it. Dix helped me understand what I had actually purchased. The hull was sound. George had been meticulous about that. But the systems were aged. The main diesel engine needed professional service. The electrical wire was a mix of 3 different decades of work. The plumbing was functional, but barely. And the interior cabin quarters were mold-prone and in need of a full gut. He also helped me understand that living aboard, which is what I was clearly planning even before I admitted it to myself, was legal at this marina for an annual fee significantly lower than the cheapest apartment in the county. This was, as he put it, a fact that George had discovered 30 years ago and never looked back from. I moved on to the Mira Jean that afternoon. It was the strangest homecoming I have ever felt. I had never lived on a boat. I had never lived alone. I had, for the past 6 weeks, been sleeping in a Civic, and now I was in a small cabin that smelled of old wood and river damp, listening to the Altamaha move beneath me, and for the first time in 8 months, I felt something that took me a moment to identify. Safe, not comfortable, not settled, not okay, just safe, like the river itself was keeping watch. The first week was practical survival. I found work at a bait shop 2 miles from the marina, cash on the table, 6 days a week, 5 in the morning to noon. The owner, a compact, weathered woman named Patsy, hired me on the spot when I told her my father had been a river pilot. You know what a Carolina rig is? She asked. Bullet, weight, swivel, leader, hook. I said, you're hired. I used my first paycheck on cleaning supplies and a headlamp and a replacement gasket for the engine room bilge pump, which Dix helped me install on a Sunday afternoon while explaining things at a speed that assumed I was both competent and willing to learn. I was both. I found the first clue on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after moving aboard. I had been systematically cleaning the Mira Jean from bow to stern, the way you have to clean a space before you can really understand it. I was in the main cabin, wiping down the interior paneling, when I noticed something behind the small built-in bookshelf on the port wall. The shelf held a collection of river charts, a few paperback novels with broken spines, and a King James Bible with a cracked leather cover. I was dusting behind the Bible when my fingers found a gap in the paneling that wasn't there in the rest of the wall. I pressed it. Nothing. I pushed from a different angle. Still nothing. I pulled the Bible off the shelf and looked at where it had been sitting, and I saw it, a thin seam running along the bottom of the shelf bracket, almost invisible unless you were looking at it from exactly the right angle, a seam that didn't match the construction of the rest of the cabinet. I went and got a flathead screwdriver from the engine room toolbox. It took 10 minutes of careful work to find the release, a small wooden button hidden in the bracket joint, the kind of thing you would only discover if you were either very lucky or very thorough. I pressed it, and with a faint click, the bottom of the shelf pivoted forward on a hidden hinge. Behind it was a small cavity, maybe 8 inches deep and a foot wide, cut directly into the hull framing. And inside the cavity was a tin box, the kind you might keep tea in, painted dark green with a small river crane on the lid. My heart was hammering. I lifted it out. It was heavier than the size suggested. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth to protect against moisture, were 3 things: a folded letter, a smaller envelope sealed with wax, and a worn leather notebook. On the front of the folded letter, in handwriting that was deliberate and careful, were 2 words: finders keepers. I went up to the wheelhouse, sat in the captain's chair, George's chair, and opened the letter. If you found this, then you found a Mira Jean and she found you. That's not an accident. I've been around this river long enough to know that things end up where they're supposed to. My name is George Aldrich Fenn. I spent 31 years on this boat. She is the truest thing I have ever owned, and I am leaving this letter because I have a bad heart and a doctor who is very honest with me, and I would like someone to know the truth before it goes with me. The truth is this. I owe a debt I cannot repay in person, but maybe I can repay it in property. There is something in the engine room of this boat that I have been keeping safe for a long time. It belongs to a young woman I knew briefly, who trusted me without reason to trust me, and whose family deserves to know it exists. I try to find them. I ran out of time. If you are reading this, I am asking you to finish what I started. The engine room will tell you what you need to know. Look for the false floor panel beneath the port engine housing. You'll need to remove the access plate bolted to the lower frame. There's a combination. The combination is the year the Mira Jean was commissioned, 1967. Whatever you find, use it well. This boat has good bones and a good heart. So I imagine, do you? George Aldrich Fenn. I sat in the wheelhouse for a long time after I read it. The river moved beneath me. A great blue heron landed on the dock railing 30 feet away and regarded me with complete indifference. Then I went to the engine room. The engine room of the Mira Jean was a low-ceiling space that smelled powerfully of diesel and iron. The main engine, a Caterpillar that George had kept against all odds in genuinely good condition, occupied most of the space. Along the port side was a secondary housing for the auxiliary generator, bolted to the lower frame. I got down on my hands and knees with a headlamp and found the access plate exactly where the letter said it would be. 8 bolts metric, which meant the right wrench was in the third drawer of George's impeccably organized toolbox. 30 minutes of work. 2 skinned knuckles. The plate came free. Below it was a recessed compartment cut into the bilge frame, dry, lined with rubber gasket material to keep the river out, and inside it, a heavy steel lockbox with a combination dial. I dialed 1967. The lock released. Inside the box were 2 stacks of documents in sealed waterproof sleeves, a bundle of handwritten letters tied with a length of kitchen twine, and a small spiral notebook with the words for whoever comes next written on the cover in the same careful hand as the letter upstairs. I brought everything to the wheelhouse table. I sat down. I opened the spiral notebook. The notebook was George's account of everything. 30 years earlier, he wrote, he had been working a commercial tug on the lower Altamaha when he encountered a woman in distress on the riverbank near a small boat launched south of town. She was young, mid-20s, with a small child on her hip and a broken-down pickup truck behind her. No phone signal. No other traffic on that stretch of road. He had pulled the Mira Jean to the bank and offered help. Her name was Nora Voss. I stopped reading. I read the name again. Nora Voss. My mother's name was Deborah. Deborah and Voss before she married my father and became Deborah Crane. She died when I was 4. A drowning accident at a river cabin. One of the things I know about her more from official records than from memory, because 4 is too young to hold much. I did the math in my head. 30 years ago, she would have been in her mid-20s. She would have had a small child. She would have had me. I put the notebook down on the chart table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. Outside, the river moved. The heron was still on the dock railing, utterly unbothered. I picked up the notebook and kept reading. George wrote that Deborah had been driving to visit her parents when the truck broke down. He fixed the truck. He had a basic toolkit and the kind of mechanical knowledge that came from keeping a 30-year-old diesel engine running on a riverman's budget. He gave her water and crackers from the galley and held the small child, me, presumably, though I appear in the account only as her little one, while Deborah ate. They talked for 2 hours while he worked. She was, he wrote, one of those people who made you feel immediately that you had known them longer than you had. She was funny and sharp, and she loved the river with the same wordless instinct he did. Before she left, she gave him a box. She had been driving it to her parents' house. She explained, to ask them to hold it for safekeeping. She and her husband were going through a difficult time financially, and she was worried. She didn't want to say more than that, and he didn't ask. The box contained, she told him, documents belonging to her family, property deeds, stock certificates, a trust established by her grandfather. Her family's whole financial history, inherited from her grandmother, who had emigrated from Germany in the 1950s and survived, as George put it carefully, a great deal, and who had learned to keep everything important in physical form because she trusted paper more than institutions. The truck had broken down twice on the drive. Deborah was nervous about getting home safely. She asked George, this stranger she had just met, if he would keep the box on the boat for a few days until she could come back with a reliable vehicle. He said yes. She drove away. She never came back. George searched for her. He had her first name and her maiden name. She had introduced herself as Nora Voss, the married name coming only later in their conversation, and a general sense that she lived somewhere upriver. He placed notices. He asked around at the marinas. Nothing. 2 years later, he found a brief obituary in a county paper. Deborah Crane, née Voss, 27, survived by her husband and her daughter. Drowning accident. He had kept the box for 30 years. He had tried to find a daughter. He had found only dead ends, a closed estate, a remarried father who moved twice, a minor child absorbed into a new family structure that was difficult to trace. He died still trying, and the box had stayed in the engine room of the Mira Jean, waiting. I need to be honest with you about what happened next, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this mean anything. I did not immediately feel joy. I did not feel like the universe had arranged this beautiful moment for me. I sat in the wheelhouse of a tugboat I had bought for $10, and I cried in a way I had not cried since my father's funeral. Ugly, gasping, completely undignified crying, because here is what it meant. It meant that 30 years ago, my mother was alive and driving through the Georgia lowlands with me on her hip and the whole of her family's history in a box in the cab of her truck. And she met a stranger who was kind to her, and 2 years later she was gone. And the stranger kept his promise for the rest of his life. George Aldrich Fenn, river pilot, died alone on the boat he loved, still trying to find the daughter of a woman he had met once on a riverbank. He had kept faith with a stranger for 3 decades because that is the kind of man he was. I cried for my mother. I cried for George. I cried for the strange, specific grief of discovering that you were loved by someone you never knew. Then I opened the second seal sleeve and started reading the documents. Now here's where I need to pause again, because what I found in those documents changed the material reality of my life, and I want to be careful about how I say that, because the point of this story is not the money. The point of the story is everything that happened before and after, but I'd be lying if I skipped it. So here it is. My maternal grandmother, Elena Voss, had come to America in 1952 with very little. She had spent her working life as a seamstress and a bookkeeper, and had saved with ferocity that the notebook described as almost military in its discipline. Over 40 years, she had accumulated a modest portfolio of stocks, a parcel of land in rural North Georgia that she had purchased in 1971, and a family trust that she had established in 1988 to protect everything from probate. The trust had been designed to pass directly to her descendants. Her daughter, my mother, had been the primary beneficiary. Upon my mother's death, the document specified, the assets passed to her children. To me, the land alone. Dix later helped me verify through a county record search, was 17 acres in a part of North Georgia that had appreciated significantly. The stock certificates were for companies that had split and grown. The total value, when I eventually sat across from a lawyer named Ruth Hollingsworth in her Baxley office, and she quietly set down her pen and looked at me over her reading glasses, was considerably more than I could have imagined while sleeping in a Cracker Barrel parking lot. Your grandmother, Ruth said carefully, was a very careful woman. I never met her, I said. No, but she thought about you. She built all of this so it would reach you. Ruth looked back at the documents, and a river pilot kept it safe for 30 years. She shook her head slowly. I've been doing estate law for 22 years. I have never seen anything like this. But here is what I want to tell you about the weeks between finding the documents and sitting in Ruth's office, because those weeks are actually the heart of the story. I didn't know what the documents were fully worth yet. I had a general sense that they were significant, but I had no legal standing, no certainty, and no idea how to navigate what came next. What I had was a Mira Jean, a job at Patsy's bait shop, and Dick's Cawley, who turned out to be one of the most practically wise people I've ever met. And I had the bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine. Those letters were George's correspondence, or attempted correspondence. Over 30 years of looking for Deborah Voss's family. Letters to county clerks. Letters to estate lawyers. One letter to a private investigator. One letter, sent to what he believed was my father's last known address, that was returned unopened with no forwarding information. He never gave up. He just kept writing. I read every letter. By the time I finished, I understood something about George Aldrich Fenn that I think matters. He was not a dramatic man. He did not appear to have considered himself heroic. He simply made a promise to a woman in trouble, and he kept it year after year, because that was the right thing to do, and he was the kind of person who did the right thing regardless of whether anyone was watching. He was the kind of person my father was. I think that's why the Mira Jean felt familiar the first moment I stepped onto her deck. The trouble came at the end of the 4th week. I was aboard the Mira Jean on a Tuesday morning, sanding the cabin trim, when a car I didn't recognize pulled into the marina parking lot. 2 men got out, both in a kind of business casual that looked aggressively mismatched against a working marina. One of them had a folder. They introduced themselves as representatives of Riverside Landing Developments, LLC. They explained, acquiring properties along the stretch of the Altamaha for a planned resort and private marina development. They had recently purchased several of the commercial properties adjacent to the marina. They were now interested in the marina itself and the vessels registered there. They had done their research. They knew I had recently acquired the Mira Jean, and they knew I was in the early stages of a legal process related to her contents. They wanted to make an offer before that process complicated things. The offer was for the boat, not the documents. They were careful to say they had no interest in the documents, just the vessel. They offered $4,000. I looked at the folder. I looked at the 2 men. I looked at Dix, who had come out of the harbor master's office and was standing 10 feet away with his arms crossed, and an expression I had come to read as contained displeasure. "I'll think about it," I said. "We'd appreciate a timely response," the one with the folder said. "Our timeline for the development is moving quickly. If the marina comes under new ownership, the mooring situation here becomes considerably less certain for independent vessels." It was a threat dressed in the language of information. They left. Dix walked over. "That's the 3rd time they've been here in 2 months, he said. "First time they've come while you were aboard. What do they want with the marina? They want the river access. There's a consortium putting together a high-end fishing resort operation. They need a working marina as part of the infrastructure." He looked out at the water. "They've been pressuring the owner for 6 months. He's old and tired, and I think he's close to selling." He looked at me. "If he does, the new owners can set mooring rates however they want." I looked at the Mira Jean, at her worn hull and her careful name, and George's photograph still on the shelf in the wheelhouse. I had found this boat through a $10 auction. I had found my grandmother's legacy in her engine room. I was 20 years old, and I had nothing except what was right in front of me. I was not going to let a development company take it. Ruth Hollingsworth, it turned out, was not just an estate lawyer. She had spent 15 years in property law before narrowing her practice, and she had personal and professional history with the kind of land acquisition tactics that Riverside Landing was deploying. "They're not wrong that they can complicate your mooring situation," she told me, sitting at her desk with the development company's folder open in front of her. "But they're also not as strong as they want you to believe. The marina owner has a long-term mooring agreement with several vessels here, including the Mira Jean's previous registration. That doesn't automatically transfer, but it creates a complication for them." "What do I actually have?" I asked. "You have a legally purchased vessel, a documented chain of custody for the contents, and a straightforward inheritance claim that I expect to have fully settled within 60 days. She folded her hands. "What you also have, if these documents are as significant as they appear, is a financial standing to be an interested party in any marina ownership negotiation." She paused. The marina owner. Has anyone spoken with him directly? His name was Wallace Pryor. He was 77 years old, and he had run Pryor's Marina for 41 years. He lived in a small house at the edge of the marina property, and he had, as Dix described it, been coming in later every morning for the past year, which Dix read as a man who was running out of reasons to hurry. I went to see him. Wallace Pryor answered the door in suspenders and reading glasses, holding a cup of coffee and a paperback Western novel with a bookmark in the middle. He looked at me with the particular patience of someone who has had a long time to learn that unexpected visitors are rarely as urgent as they believe themselves to be. I told him everything. My father, the auction, George's letter, the documents in the engine room, the development company's visit. I sat at his kitchen table for an hour and told him the whole improbable sequence of events, and he listened without interrupting, refilling my coffee once. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "George Fenn," he said finally. I knew George. Good man. Kept that boat better than most men keep their houses. He looked at his coffee cup. I didn't know about any of this. The documents, the woman on the riverbank. George was private. He was trying to do the right thing, I said. For 30 years. Wallace nodded slowly. "What are you asking me?" "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. "I know that the development company wants this marina. I know that if they get it, boats like the Mira Jean are probably going to get pushed out because they don't fit the resort image. I know George loved this river and this marina and this community, and I think he would have hated to see it turn into something that serves people who are just passing through. And you?" Wallace looked at me carefully. "What do you want with this river?" I thought about my father. I thought about my mother, mid-20s, driving along the river road with me on her hip and a box full of her family's history. I thought about the moment I stepped onto the Mira Jean's deck and felt the recognition I still can't adequately name. "I want to stay," I said. "I want to learn this river the way my father knew his. I want to do something here that lasts." Wallace looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "My daughter has been after me for 5 years to sell this place. She lives in Atlanta. She doesn't understand what it is." He set down his coffee. "But you do, don't you?" "I think I'm starting to. I am going to skip over some of the legal and financial detail here, because it is complicated and the specifics are not the point. What matters is this. Ruth settled the inheritance claim in 53 days. The assets were real, the trust was valid, and my grandmother's careful, decades-long provision for her family reached me across 30 years and a river pilot's promise. Wallace Pryor did not sell to Riverside Landing. He sold a stake in the marina to a small partnership that included, among others, a 20-year-old woman who had bought a tugboat for $10 and found her family's history in the engine room. The partnership structure protected the working marina character of the property and established a preservation covenant that restricted the kind of resort development that Riverside Landing had been planning. Riverside Landing's representatives came back twice. The second time, Ruth was with me, and the conversation was considerably shorter. Here's what the Mira Jean looks like now. Her hull is painted fresh. The same dark color George kept her, because I wasn't going to change that. The rust is gone. The engine has been professionally serviced and runs with a steadiness that Dick says would have made George happy. The wheelhouse instruments have been updated where necessary and preserved where possible. His photograph is still on the shelf above the chart table. I live aboard her still. The cabin is dry now, properly insulated, with a small wood stove I install myself, or most of myself, with Dick supervising and occasionally taking over when I was about to do something inadvisable. The bookshelf holds river charts and navigation manuals, and in the spot where the Bible was, the spiral notebook George called for whoever comes next. I am learning the river. Dix is teaching me. He has been on the Altamaha for 40 years, and he knows it the way my father knew the Chattahoochee, by instinct and memory, and the particular way the light sits on the water at different hours. He says I have good river sense, which I think he means as a compliment, and which I am choosing to take as one. Patsy gave me more hours at the bait shop. I study for my OUPV, that's the captain's license, on the Mira Jean's chart table in the evenings, with the river moving beneath me and the lights of the marina reflected on the water. There's a woman named Cora who runs a small nonprofit that connects at-risk youth with outdoor education programs. She contacted me after word got around the county about what had happened with the marina. Small towns move information fast, and asked if I would consider partnering, using the Mira Jean for river education programs, bringing kids onto the water who have never had the chance. I said yes before she finished asking. The first group comes out next month. I want to tell you about one more thing, and then I'll let you go. 3 weeks after the inheritance was settled, I drove north of property in rural North Georgia that my grandmother had bought in 1971, the land that had been sitting in a trust for decades, waiting. It was 17 acres of mixed hardwood forest and open meadow, with a creek running through the lower corner, and a view of the mountains that made me stand at the tree line for 10 minutes without speaking. There was no structure on the land, just the land itself and the creek and the mountains and the sky. I found a flat rock near the creek, and I sat on it, and I thought about Nora Voss, my grandmother, who came to this country with nothing and spent 40 years building something she would never see completed. I thought about my mother, Deborah, who was driving to keep that something safe on the day she met a river pilot who kept his word for 30 years. I thought about George Aldrich Fenn, who died alone on a tugboat, but not, I have come to believe, without hope, because he had written for whoever comes next, and whoever comes next suggests that he trusted the next person was coming. And I thought about my father, who smelled like diesel and coffee and river water, and who talked about the water with his whole face changed, lighter, and who I only half listened to because I was 17 and thought I had better things to do. I don't half listen anymore. I sat on that rock by the creek for a long time. Then I drove back to the Altamont, and I went aboard the Mira Jean, and I made dinner in the small galley, and I ate it at the chart table with the river moving beneath me. I was 20 years old. I had been thrown out with a garbage bag on my birthday. I had slept in Civic for 6 weeks and eaten dollar menu food and been invisible in the specific, grinding way that people without addresses are invisible in this country. And now I had a home. 2 of them, actually, the boat on the river and the land in the mountains, though both of them still need more work than I can currently manage, which I suspect is exactly as it should be. A home you earn while you're building it is a different thing from a home you simply inherit. George understood that. My grandmother understood that. My father, I think, understood it too. The lesson I keep coming back to is this. The people who loved you were working on your behalf even when you didn't know it. They were making promises and keeping them and building things with their hands and trusting that what they built would reach you somehow, some way, even if they didn't get to see it happen. My grandmother saved for 40 years. George kept a promise for 30. A tugboat called the Mira Jean sat in a county impound for 2 years until someone desperate enough to bid $10 on a rust streak vessel came along and found the engine room. That someone was me. I don't know if you'd call that fate. I don't know if that's the right word for it. But I know that if I had not been thrown out with a garbage bag, if I had not been desperate and broke and scrolling a county auction website at a library table at 2 in the afternoon with nowhere else to be, I would never have seen that listing. I would never have placed that bid. I would never have stepped onto that deck and felt the recognition. Sometimes being at the bottom is the only angle from which you can see the door. So that's where I am, living on a river, learning to pilot, teaching kids who have never been on the water what it feels like when a boat moves under you for first time, that primal shift, that floating surface, that feeling of being held up by something larger than yourself. George's photograph is on the shelf above the chart table. My mother is in a frame print I had made from an old photo I found in my father's things after he died. She is laughing at something off camera, her whole face lit up. They keep each other company up there. And on the shelf beside them, held between 2 small brackets that I made myself out of river hardwood, is the tin box with the crane on the lid. Empty now, but kept. Because some things you hold on to not for what they contain, but for what they mean. If this story reached you, if any part felt like something you needed to hear today, please subscribe to this channel. We tell stories here about second chances and unexpected homes, and a particular kind of grace that shows up when you run out of other options. Leave me a comment. Tell me about the door you found when you were at the bottom looking up. I read every single one. And if you're at the bottom right now, if today is a garbage bag day, the parking lot night, the end of the thing you were counting on, I want you to know something. Someone, somewhere, kept a promise for you. You just haven't found the engine room yet.